So far in 2021, there are basically two sorts of legislation that Republican state legislatures are interested in passing. Efforts to curtail voting after the huge rise in participation in last year's election, and bills designed to reassure their base that they absolutely despise members of the transgender community. And unfortunately, we turn now to Tennessee, the most recent battleground for the latter sort of bill, where we have the governor, Bill Lee, signing multiple pieces of legislation targeting transgender Tennesseans. We're very lucky, by the way, to be joined now to discuss these pieces of legislation. Civil rights and consumer law attorney Sheryl Ring joins us on the Damage Report. Sheryl, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So we've got a couple pieces of legislation, 1182 and 529. Why don't we start with the first? What is this all about, and why is it drawing such a negative reaction?
So Bill 1182 is most noteworthy for creating what a lot of us in the legal community are calling a return to segregation. Only this time it's segregating transgender people. And essentially what businesses have to do if they serve trans people is they have to post a sign in their window or as well as at the bathroom, saying that they allow trans people to use their bathrooms and that they serve trans people. Most importantly, though, this is not language that says we are trans inclusive. This is language that's essentially misgenders trans people. And worse than that, it essentially creates this incentive for businesses to not serve trans people so as to avoid putting up the sign. Now, when this was passed, the district attorney for Nashville said that he was not going to enforce it. And in response, the sponsor of the bill pointed out that it is actually a misdemeanor to not comply with the bill. So if you run a business and you refuse to either say, I won't serve trans people, or I won't put up a sign in my window that misgenders trans people, you can actually serve jail time as the owner of a business for failing to do that. And it is thus far, we've seen some pretty bad bills across the country. Florida is the most recent one. There was a signing ceremony this morning on the first day of Pride. But the Tennessee one is the most noteworthy so far because it is I think the most egregious. It is essentially an attempt to keep trans people out of the public sphere.
And I know this is all very recent. Has there been enough time yet to see if you hypothesize that it might lead to some businesses choosing to not be inclusive so that they don't have to put up signs like this? Do we know yet if that strategy seems to be working?
At this point, it's too early to tell. The law, in addition to being extremely bigoted, is also extremely poorly written. The only thing that we know is that if you intend to comply with the law, you have to put up a sign that essentially is segregation. Either we don't serve trans people, or we serve, or the wording is analogous to we allow people of the opposite sex to use any bathroom, which is misgendering and humiliating. And it also creates enforcement problems. How is a business going to enforce this? Are they going to have someone standing at the door saying, can I inspect your genitalia? There's really no way of enforcing this in any kind of reasonable way. And it is going to lead to cis people as well being stopped if people are under the mistaken impression that they're trans. And this happens every time we see anti-trans bills. They encompass cis people also. And so the Tennessee legislature does seem to be adamant that this is a misdemeanor, that there will be criminal charges for failing to comply. At this point, there haven't been any yet, so we don't know how that's going to happen. But it is a badly written, very bigoted law, and the consequences of that are going to be far-reaching, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And for people like me who are in the trans community, it creates a problem of, if we are going through a state like Tennessee right now, what are our rights? Do we still have the right to travel in Tennessee? Do people who live in Tennessee have the right to use public accommodations at this point? And all of this is up in the air.
And I have to assume that one of the consequences will be some sort of legal challenge to this bill. As you point out, there seem to be issues with the ability for it to be enforced, the vagueness, not to mention, obviously, the fact that it's demonizing a community. I'm assuming these challenges will come. Do you have any predictions for how it might fare in the legal system?
Under ordinary circumstances, I would say that a law like this has very little chance of being upheld for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is already, thanks to Bostock, the ruling from a couple of years ago, where Justice Gorsuch actually did rule that gender identity is protected as part of sex for purposes of employment law. And so under ordinary circumstances, I would say that it is likely that a law like this would be struck down. However, Justice Gorsuch, in that opinion, did leave several openings, including for religious exemptions and for bathroom bills. And that was something that was not noted at the time very much, but it is true. Justice Gorsuch did say that this ruling does not address bathroom bills, and he was essentially giving an invitation to right-wing legislatures to pass bathroom bills to challenge Bostock in the future. So I think it is at best unclear what a federal judiciary, which still has about half of all of its judges appointed by Donald Trump, how that is going to react to these kinds of laws. It is possible that this one is a bridge too far, and I'm hoping that that courts look at it that way, but I am not yet optimistic in light of what we've seen so far in courts reacting to these anti-trans bills.
Okay. And so that was 1182. We also have 529. Can you tell us about that?
And so this is the sort of trans kids in sports type thing that a lot of states are passing. And we've seen bills like this everywhere from the Dakotas to Florida to Arkansas. And basically these bills are of one of two flavors. Number one, they say that if you are a trans child, you are not allowed to compete in scholastic sports. And the other thing it essentially does is it actually criminalizes childhood transition. And these bills do this in a number of ways. The Arkansas one is most notable because it actually made it a felony to provide affirming care to minors. And that was the most egregious one. And that seems to, it was so egregious that Governor Asa Hutchinson actually vetoed it. And then the legislature overrode his veto. And the Tennessee bill does very much the same thing, that we as the state are going to say that you are not allowed to transition. And if you do transition, it is a crime to affirm you, and you cannot compete in scholastic sports. And the irony is that at the time, for example, the Arkansas bill was passed, there were 0 trans children competing in any kind of scholastic sports in the entire state, and there were only 200 trans kids in the entire state. And so in addition to being extremely prejudiced, it's also addressing a problem that doesn't exist. There is no data anywhere that suggests that trans people have an unfair advantage when it comes to competing. It also is, and I feel like this is important, it also is this idea that the only people who are trans are assigned male at birth. There is this idea that it erases trans men. It does not acknowledge non-binary people. It is this idea that only assigned male at birth trans people exist, and that we transition solely for the purpose of excelling in high school or college sports, which is frankly insane.
Yeah, it seems like that's a hypothesis that would sort of demand a little bit of evidence, considering everything else we know about the experience, the way that society, the states, the United States generally has treated the community, the idea that all of this would be done for some sort of ephemeral, temporary advantage in high school sports seems like if you're going to say something like that, you should probably provide a little bit of evidence, but they haven't required it. As you point out, I think totally rightly, it is addressing a problem that doesn't exist under the guise of a standard that doesn't exist. They're pretending as if they just care so much about the integrity of women's sports. I've never seen any other evidence of that. I'm just a guy who talks on the internet, so I can just say my opinion, which is this is entirely based on they want to have a community to attack. They want their base to feel open and free, to feel prejudiced and hateful towards this group. You come from a different world, civil rights, consumer law, all of that. Is there anything else to that? And if it is that something that you fear or feel might work politically?
It's interesting because as an attorney, I view this as an attack on fundamental rights. As a trans woman, I feel this as an attack on my community. And I can tell you that, unfortunately, there is still this idea that we are an other, right? That we are freaks, for lack of a better term. I mean, if you look at the way that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or even former President Trump talked about my community as though there is something wrong with us, as though we are deviants in some way. And there is, and unfortunately, even in the legal community, I get on a fairly regular basis this idea from judges that that I am not a trustworthy person because I am trans, because they do not trust me because I am trans. And it is very hard being a trans attorney in that way, because I see that kind of prejudice coming from the attorneys that I'm arguing in front of on behalf of clients. One thing I will say is, if you look at what we're trying to, what they're trying to do, trans contestants have been allowed in the Olympics for decades, and there has yet to be a single trans medalist even. And what's interesting is, and I've spoken about this before, if you look at the reason why trans people are being targeted specifically in sports, it is the same kind of thing that targets, I would say, Caster Semenya or Naomi Osaka. This idea that womanhood needs to be reserved for cis white women, and that if you have any kind of advantage over cis white women, you need to be excluded. And it is why there is so much overlap between transphobia and racism, that you see if you are a talented Black woman, you are excluded from sports, much in the same way that if you are a talented trans person. And yet we never see Michael Phelps being banned, even though they're talking about banning moves that Gabby Douglas is or Simone Biles is so good at. And so the reality is that if you are looking at sports and you're saying, well, why is there an unfair advantage? You never talk about that in the context of cis white athletes, and only in the context of Black and trans athletes. And that's really the big problem if you're looking at what is the crux of this. The crux of this is it's a combination of transphobia and white supremacy.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.